Hello, everyone, and welcome to Claris Community Live. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Marc Larochelle from Productive Computing back, and he's going to go farther and deeper into using JSON with FileMaker. And this is building off of a session we did last September, and I will drop the link for that in chat. And while we get started, please do take our opening poll, which is just to get a sense of where you as an audience are in your JSON experience. And to get to the poll, click on the 4 squares in the lower right that say apps and select Slido. And then once you open up Slido, you should see the poll that has 2 questions. First, do you use JSON in your FileMaker apps? And how comfortable are you using JSON? And so Marc, if you want to introduce yourself and just maybe give a little recap of what we talked about in September while I find the link to September's episode.
Sure. Thanks, Rosemary. Yes, this is part 2 of the JSON Community Edition. In part 1, we learned what JSON is. We learned a lot of the fundamentals, how it's constructed, why it's important. So honestly, this particular webinar is going to be on the much deeper side of the pool in terms of practical use cases. We'll be parsing some advanced JSON, talking about some advanced concepts. And so there's a lot to cover, but if you are brand new to JSON, I highly recommend watching part 1 first to get the lay of the land and all those basic fundamentals out of the way. So without further ado, that is about what you can expect from part 1 and part 2. I'm Marc Larochelle from Productive Computing. We are a platinum partner with Claris, and we do training like you see here on this webinar, as well as custom web development, custom development with FileMaker. We do plugins. We've been known for plugins since the very beginning, and we do a variety of other things, including hosting, consultation, and so forth. So that is about me. Should I start the fun?
I think, well, we got some good results in the poll, and I'll just share. We have about 80 votes in each poll. And for the first question, do you use JSON in your FileMaker apps? 85% yes, 15% no. So clearly people have adopted. And then for comfort, this breaks down to about thirds. About a third answered, I use JSON all day, every day. About a third, little more than a third, I use JSON when I need it for API integrations. And about just under a quarter, I use JSON rarely. I need to look up how the functions work every time. And I firmly fall in that camp. And about 6% are not using JSON at all.
Well, from my memory, that's a lot better stats than it was on the first part 1.
Yeah.
Where a lot of people were just seeing JSON for the very first time and so forth. So I guess that's a huge improvement in terms of skill set and capability for all those developers watching today.
Yeah.
Compared to the first time. Great. Well, let me share my screen. Okay, you should see a screen here. And we are going to just quickly talk about part 1 very briefly, where we explored.
You are not sharing.
Oh, yes, you're right. Thank you. Stand by. And we will do this instead. Now you should see it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes. All right, perfect. So we explored the JSON basics in part 1, and we took a look at APIs and their importance in the marketplace, as well as the fact that they all or most of them use JSON in one form or another. So understanding an API is really essential, goes hand in hand with understanding JSON. So that, again, I encourage you to go back to that part 1 if you're brand new. In its raw sense, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's a universal standard for data exchange, and it's a text format, not a programming language. So most of us are familiar with CSV formatting. When you take a flat file and you export it to a CSV. This is sort of the big brother to that. This takes that to a whole nother level. The huge advantage of JSON is that it's both human readable and machine readable simultaneously. So you get a lot more flexibility with JSON, which is why it's been adopted as a standard today. Developers use JSON. A lot of beginning developers or people just starting with JSON, they use it to pass FileMaker script parameters. So it's a handy way of coordinating a parameter that has multiple values. It is used in a variety of FileMaker script steps today. One of the big ones is insert from URL. A lot of times you'll need to construct JSON in order to make an API call. There are a lot of FileMaker functions, which we'll focus on today in a demo coming up. And then, of course, any sort of FileMaker integration, AI integration, especially advanced AI integration, is going to require the JSON skill set for you as a developer. So there's a lot of reasons to learn JSON, a lot of reasons to continue using it.
Actually, I have a question.
Sure.
What is the standard text encoding that JSON uses?
I don't know if I can answer that right now. I don't know at the moment. I would imagine that's the first time anyone's ever asked that question to me, but it probably sounds like a very basic question. So why don't you do a quick search on that, Angie, while we do because I'm curious myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience, it's much like FileMaker,
Mhm.
where, you're using whatever it is in, so probably Unicode if you're staying within the FileMaker context, but if you're going out, if you're exporting JSON to a text file, you're going to do what it will apply whatever text encoding you put in your export file script step. But yeah, that's a good question, and I will make a note to look it up and add it to our discussion thread
Yeah, I mean,
with an answer.
from the in most things that you use, like if you're using a FileMaker function or you're building an API call, it doesn't really come up much as a thing. But you're right. I mean, JSON can handle things like emojis and things like that. So uh, it's flexible in that way. And we may touch upon some of that too coming up. And like I mentioned already, API integration is going to require JSON back and forth. So definitely it is the way of the world nowadays. So this is an example of all the different functions in FileMaker that currently use and utilize JSON. And we are going to be focusing on one of these in particular, the one called Get System Local Elements, which is one that we don't tend to use much as FileMaker developers, but it's there for the taking. And we're going to kind of open that up and look at this here in detail with a demo that I've prepared. Okay. So here's a FileMaker demo that we have, and I'm just calling this tab System Local Elements. And there's an option. Let me open up my data viewer. And let me just clear anything that had the word confusion. If you were to take a data viewer and just open up a new expression and then get system local elements, what you'll get returned to you is fairly elaborate JSON, which indicates that users, you can call them preferences or system settings in JSON format. And it makes a good example for today where we can parse this and get some things for free. In other words, let's say I was doing a report where I wanted to name certain days, or I wanted to have an abbreviated list of the months, or the spelled out version of the months, which is what we'll do here in a second. This makes it easy to grab that. Now you might be saying, well, I can just hard code that into a value list. Well, that's great, but what if you're making a solution that supports international people, where you'd want to have a localized version of those month names or those day names? All of that's built in because it's pulling from the system, from the operating system's preferences. So that's what we've got here. I happen to be set to English at the moment, but let me take a screenshot of this. I'll adjust this so that we can have this persistently on the screen. And let me just go, I'll start here. Okay, this will get us started. And let me walk this through because I think it's important before we actually start to parse this. It's important to kind of walk this through at least once so you can see how it all works. So we have here our first key, and this is what I'm calling the root level, the first level of the JSON. So we have a key called API version and its value of 1. We have currency. And currency breaks out into additional keys, one for leading and one for symbol. So you could say that this is a nested object inside this currency object. But then we have date, which is on the same level as the other two. So in a sense, it's on the root level. So if I wanted to pull something from date, which I do, I want to pull the month names or the day names. In this case, I'm going to pull the day names. So I would walk it this way. I would start with date. That's the first thing I have to specify in my path. Then I'd put a dot and then DMQ. That's the second, the first child of that, if you will. And then I would put another dot for days of week. Now I wouldn't do a dot over here, first day of week, because that's only providing this one value and I don't need that. What I need is what's under days of week. So I do dot days of week. Then I would do dot name list because this is what I'm after here, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Now, I've done that successfully, but now I see my first straight bracket, which indicates that this particular key has multiple values. It's got an index, if you will, of multiple values. So at this point, I have to sort of change the way I parse this and introduce this straight bracket and a number starting from 0 through, let's say, 6. There's 7 days of the week, but everything in JSON is 0 based when it comes to arrays. So this would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's how I would parse this. And we're going to do this again here in the actual data viewer. And then this will make even more sense. But we wanted to just walk that through. And you're going to see this over and over again here as we parse other pieces of data for the next demo. So I'll create an expression, and I'll do this work, if you will, in the data viewer. It's a great way to get started so that you can kind of figure it out as you go. So I'll create a new expression up here. And this is, I'll just start with JSON. That'll get me into the right family of JSON functions. And then we'll do get element. So it's asking for the JSON to parse, and then it's asking for the path to that JSON. So the parsing part is going to be that get function, get local, system local elements. Okay. Now to get started, this is what I do. Maybe other people do it different ways, but I'll just start with 2 quotes, 2 double quotes, and that will get me all the JSON like that. Now you could potentially help yourself out by introducing another function, JSON format elements. And by doing that and surrounding that, using that function, it will make it much more readable so that when you're actually parsing this, you can sort of parse on the fly. So you can see it's doing the exact same thing here as our reference. So now in my key, it's just pretty straightforward. If I wanted, let's say, currency, I don't want currency, but if I did, I could put in currency in my path, and it would give me the object contained within the currency key, which is leading and symbol. All right, so that's just to give you an idea of how that works. So now I want to go back here. And what I really want is date and .dmq. So I'll just start with date and see what that looks like. So I'll put in date. It is case sensitive too, by the way. So now I've honed in on date. Now I'll go one step further, .dmq. Oops. Okay, now I'm getting closer and closer to what I need. The next thing I need is days of week, spelled just like that. And now I'm getting much closer. Now I need name list. And now remember, this is where the array starts here. So if I do .name list, we're really close now. So at this point, you see that there are no keys. The key is name list, and I'm now just left with an array of values. So at this point, I would introduce a left bracket like this, a straight bracket, and then I'd put in 0 and a right bracket, And let's see, what did I do here? Dot. Let me put in a 1. What's going on here? What am I thinking about? Doing quotes. Stand by. Let me go check. Oh, JSON format. Yeah. That's right. I don't normally use the JSON format. Okay. Let's do this. Thank you for that. I love having the comments come out. So I put a 0 in, and that gets me Sunday. Now, what just happened to me is that I was actually formatting the JSON so that it'd be read friendly, and that was conflicting with parsing the key. So that's what it looks like. So that's the 0. And if I put a 1 here, that's Monday, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. So that's how you parse an elaborate string or elaborate path to JSON, and then the keys within that. So if you take this same concept and you apply it to a script, you can loop through. And let me go to the script that represents this. I'll just click the button here for days. And then we see Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So let's go see how I applied that in the FileMaker script. How did I get that information out? So this is the script that pulls those days in. And we have, I'll just walk through the script real quickly. We have the JSON get system local elements. So we first store that function, all that JSON in a variable. That way we have it and we can reuse it over and over again. And then we set up what I call a traditional loop. We'll want to set the index, so a variable for the index. That's going to be set to 0. Normally, when we think about traditional FileMaker loops, we would set our variable counter to 1. But since we're parsing JSON, we have to set it to 0 ahead of time, and because we start at 0. Then we just call upon the loop script steps. And then right here on step 5, this is where we're actually parsing the JSON and setting the repeat field, the repeating field, with the information. So let me show you what that looks like. So for the field, we're setting the days field, and then the repetition of that field. Now, normally I wouldn't use a repetition necessarily for any kind of development in this way, but it works great for a demo because I can just use the one field and use this repetition option to just do the index, which is 0. At the moment, it calls this the first time, plus 1, so that plus 1 is needed so that the repetitions, which start on 1, is different than the index, which starts at 0. So that's the only reason for the plus 1. All right, so there's that. And then the actual result was very similar to what you saw me just do, which is the JSON get element, and we're parsing the key. And then right here, this is where the magic happens, where we're constructing those brackets, but instead of hard coding it to a 0 or a 1, we're just grabbing the variable that we set, which is currently 0 when this first runs. And then we have that parsing the very first value of that array. And then on step 6, we increment the counter. So I equals I plus 1. That's here. And then we exit the loop if I equals 7. In other words, if it's gone through it 7 times, which I hard coded because I knew that it was days, so didn't necessarily have to count that. And then this loops through and grabs the days and puts them in to the actual field in the field repetition.
All right, there's a couple questions about your script.
Okay.
The first is, why are you using loop, flush, defer instead of whatever those other loop flush options are?
So there's a great white paper that Claris presents. It's actually quite lengthy that you can go. And I don't know if you can look it up, Rosemary, but if you can refer to it. This is always a big question for developers. And this is a fairly new feature they introduced with the loop function. But the idea is how the loop and the data contained in that loop evaluates. So in an always situation, like if you say loop flush always, that's the default behavior when you create a new loop in any FileMaker script today. And that was what we inherited for all time. When they created loops for the first time, it was behind the scenes flushing always. which means that it's evaluating the data that you might be setting inside that loop immediately and all the time. And then you have a minimum and a defer. The minimum, I believe the way it works is that it updates items that are one relationship hop away. And then the defer is don't update anything until the loop is done. And the only reason, and you can read the white paper about all the ins and outs and advantages and disadvantages of all these three features. But the main reason that they created this was to give developers the opportunity to make their loops more performant, to go faster, because there are times where you set things and you don't necessarily need to evaluate all the connected relationships just to set a field on the parent relationship as an example. But then there are times where you do want to have it evaluate that related data before it continues to the next record in the loop. So in those cases, you would use, that's where you'd use the always. If you wanted to always evaluate everything that's possibly connected to the field you're setting, then you do the always. I tend to do defer as much as possible. I try to get into the habit of making all the scripts perform as fast as they can. So that's why I use defer in this case, because there's no relationship. I'm just setting the parent record with data. There's no reason to do that. But I will be honest and say that if I do always or defer or minimum, it's not going to make probably any difference in this actual script, which is only running 7 times. So it's almost inconsequential that I had this, one way or the other. Great question. Yeah. But in a large and lengthy script where you are setting a lot of related data, but you don't need to evaluate that related data, then the defer can really help speed that loop through, especially over the wide area network.
Now I have thoughts about improving some of my FileMaker apps. Right. I admit I have not yet really played with those. Change that setting. I usually just accept the default.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't come up too much in that exact scenario where one could benefit from it. But they created it obviously for a reason. And someone probably brought up a great point to say, we need an option to choose the cache type on the loop. So like I said, it's probably edge cases that would use it or take advantage of it, but it's there. And you'll see a couple other examples where I show you transactional and in the third demo.
Yeah, and there's a second question about, and I think you kind of addressed this in passing, but you may want to, could you go a little deeper into where your exit loop script? In this case, you have it set to hard-coded to 7 because there are 7 days of the week.
Right.
If you were doing this kind of parsing and you didn't know in advance, what calculation might you use to figure out what your index should be? Right.
Yeah. And you'll see that me use that, I believe, in the third demo that we do today. What you want to do is you want to gather the total keys that the total record count or key count, if you will, of your JSON ahead of entering a loop so that you know exactly how much is there and when to exit the loop properly. I hard-coded it here just to make it that much less to explain on this very first script. But in an actual script, in an actual real-world situation, you'd almost never hard-code an exit loop unless you knew for sure the data. But you would always capture that. And to capture that, you use a combination of value count and the JSON keys. You get the keys and then you count the keys. You count how many records are in the array that you're about to loop through. So yeah, and I believe I have an example in the third demo that goes into that, and we can talk about that more if there's time.
All right. Well,
good. And then the only other thing I wanted to show you on this particular first demo is we can do the same for months. And that is almost the identical script, with the only difference really being that we're changing this part of the key. See, it's date.dmq months versus date.dmq day list, days of week rather. So that's the only difference really between these. And then of course I hard coded to 12 because I knew that there were 12 months that we were pulling. But so that's all great. And like I mentioned, you could say, well, I can hard code those values and never have to worry about it. But if you were, let's say you introduced this to someone in France or in Canada speaking French, you can, what I did is I took my computer and changed it to French. I called the function, grabbed the JSON and stored it. So then here, if I do this, now I've got the months and the days in French because my function will pull that for me automatically. So you can imagine if you were going international on your solution, you save yourself a lot of time doing that translation or trying to build very elaborate preference files for the language, just for the month names or the day names. Now, granted, you might have to do a preference table for international language on all the other things you might present to a user, but this is at least one thing you don't have to worry about. There's other interesting things that this function provides, and that is the type of formatting for the currency and the way the dates are configured. And so all the things that you'd normally expect and you'd have to worry about when you go international with your solution. All right, so that concludes my first demo. So let me just show you, we're going to hand this off to Rosemary here in just a second. And Rosemary is going to show us her solution. I'll have her explain it here, but she's going to focus on the JSON set element. We've focused so far on the get, and she's going to do the set, and she'll also talk a little bit about JSON make array, which is another handy function in advanced JSON. So I'll let you take it away, Rosemary.
All right. Yeah, so first I'm going to show you what the ultimate goal of this. And I actually built all of this right after our September session. So I just immediately was able to apply what I learned from Marc back in September. And so you may have realized, we just had this conference and we have this nice dynamic web page that shows the sessions, and then we have a similar page for speakers. And this is very structured data, and it doesn't change very often. So we didn't want to drive this with a connection to a database. Instead, out of our FileMaker content management system, I exported JSON that our web developers then read to build this nice interactive table view with filters and all the things that this site does. So you can go to claris.com/engage/speakers to explore how the web page works and dig into the web code a little bit more if you want. But what I was going to show is how I built that JSON in FileMaker. And for this, I took kind of a two-step approach. So first, for both sessions and speakers, I created a JSON element. So this is an element that is the JSON that represents a session. And I just did that straight up in the calculation engine where I calculate the session object. So it's just using JSON set element and then setting each, here is each element and what it is. And since a session can have multiple speakers, for speakers, we make an array and then use the list function to get all of the speakers, tell the JSON that the key for that is the paragraph return, and so forth. So that's simply using the calculation engine to construct the JSON. And then when we're done with that, now I have a JSON object for every single session, as you can see as I scroll through. So then in the script, to output for the website, I build an array that is the sessions. I build a second array that is the speakers, and then output that as a file. And so just for example, I'll show you how how this script works to compile the sessions. So for compiling the sessions, again, using loop because it's pretty quick. And I did this less than once a week. So the sessions, and it's just building a variable that is the sessions, and then just append with a paragraph return the JSON object for that session. And then at the end, I simply, set variable my JSON using the make arrays function. So just take that whole collection of paragraph delimited session objects and make an array out of them. Use the JSON make array for that. And that is how that worked. Would it help if I walk this part of the script with the data viewer so people can see how, so you can see how it works, see what the results look like? And thumbs up, yes. Okay, I will go back and share FileMaker one more time. So let me bring up the data viewer. And I apologize if it is small. And now let's just walk through. I'm just going to walk through just the session script. So as I step into this, here's my variable, current, and here is the session data for the current session. You can see that. And then here is the first session data. And now if I go back and step in again, I'm just going to loop a couple times here. And now if I bring that back up, now you can see I have one object, the next object, and so on. And then if I step out of the loop, oh, I stepped out of the script. And now it's done. So I hope that was helpful. And one approach, and this is valuable, I think, for two things. One is here's a real application where we use JSON to do something that's not passing parameters or integrating with an API. It's actually using it for the integration to a website with pretty static data that doesn't need to be updated all the time and doesn't need a live connection to a database.
And I like how you showed the demonstration of you create the object in one part of the process, and then you combine the multiple objects in the other part of the process. And FileMaker really lets you build JSON onto itself very easily.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a great example of that.
Yeah, and I'll just want to call out thanks Angie for the comment, as she was also responsible for keeping the data up to date. And so if she had to go in and make a change because a speaker changed their description or we added a session, she could go and edit the data and then push a button in FileMaker to output the JSON. She didn't need me to do that once the script was built and working. It meant that anyone with access to the content management system for Engage could hand off a website update.
Nice. That's great. Very useful.
Oh, and Joanne asks a good question. If JSON is like execute SQL, where you can use JSON and not be like on the table or related table that you need to get the data from.
So execute SQL won't necessarily produce JSON out of the box natively, but it's a great question. You probably use execute FileMaker data API, which does create JSON natively out of the box and then gives you the query option and the sort option. So I think that would be the way I would go. And you're about to see that here in the third demo. Yeah,
and I think also, Joanne, JSON is kind of independent of whatever data you're using. Your JSON is a way to format data that you want to use somewhere else. So in most cases in FileMaker, like I just showed, you're either calculating something with a calculation engine, or you're building the JSON using a script and putting it in a variable. And then, so once it's in a variable, you're independent of context, and it's just static text in that variable. All right.
All right.
So
Should we
Mark,
go on to the
why don't you
next?
go on to the last
Great. Okay. Thanks for sharing.
complicated,
Yes.
intense demo.
Right.
There's one more question, Rosemary, on
Right.
how would you export header and lines info into JSON?
I think they're referring to the HTML header.
Oh, yes. So for this, we just handed off the JSON, and then the web team integrated that into all of the whatever web coding they had done for our web example. Oh, not the HTML. So,
Let's see here.
oh, header info example if you're in an invoice. So that you would just build that all as part of your JSON, right?
Right.
Mark?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So for example, if you wanted to represent invoice and the invoice line items, you would create your parent records in one part of the JSON, and you'd create in a sense, the related line items as an array with its own objects. So like in the invoice side, you might have date, invoice number, invoice ID, company ID, anything that you'd have on the parent record of the invoice. And then for the line items, you'd have things like the ID, a line item, description, quantity, unit price, extended price, that kind of thing. And then you can construct it all in the JSON, very much like you saw in my first example where we had a set of keys and an array, and then another set of keys and an array. So what's nice about JSON is it can represent all of that in one file, whereas in a flat file or CSV, it's really hard to represent related data. Yeah.
Yeah, and David calls out that using the execute FileMaker data API script step could be really helpful for this.
Absolutely. Yeah, because it does it in a sense out of the box natively.
Yeah,
What
and
you'll
I
see
think
here.
Todd might have even done that in a demo for his community live session back in February. So
Oh yeah, most likely. Yeah, and I definitely watched that one because he goes through a variety of examples and advantages of that particular script step. That's one script step that's really powerful.
Yeah. So I've just dropped the link for that recording in the chat.
Okay, good. All right, I'll share my screen. And all right, so in this demo, we are going to talk about plotting addresses on a map. And we're going to use a combination, a variety of FileMaker techniques, and all of them involve JSON in one form or another, but we approach it from different angles. And at the end of the day, we have a really good, strong use case for that. All right, so I'll bring up the same demo now. And the same demo, which is going to be downloadable for you guys. We'll put information here towards the end. But I have this thing called plot addresses. So let me show you the results first, and then we'll break it down into pieces, and I'll explore how this comes to be with the time we have left. So the first thing we do, or the first thing I do, is we need a list of companies, their address, and their latitude and longitude so that we can have something to plot on a map. So for the actual sample data, I just use ChatGPT to say, find me 36 companies or what have you that are, publicly traded companies with their address, and then tell me the lat and long. So I actually gathered the sample data, and what I did is I put it embedded into FileMaker in one script step. Instead of storing it in a record, I just put it into the insert text script step. So this button here, create sample data, takes that pasted sample data and then populates records in FileMaker. So here's my list of companies, along with their address, lat long, and the color representing the type of company it is. The next part is similar in where I take HTML that's pre-baked to draw a map, and also using the insert text script step to put the HTML, so we have a place to store it. And then I'm going to set that in a field here. So here's all my HTML that would draw a map. I just need to go down to this one line here and comment it out so you can see what it would be as a map without data. So there's my map of the US with no data, nothing plotted yet. So I had to comment that out. But here's where the magic happens. this map is ready to accept JSON data for these companies. It's ready to accept that. And when I uncomment this, it's all going to go into this one placeholder. This placeholder will be substituted with the JSON we collect from FileMaker, this list of companies. So now when I click plot on map, all it does is it keeps the same HTML, but substitutes that placeholder here with the actual JSON that we collected from FileMaker. Now, I've highlighted it in yellow just to make it really obvious where the data is that's dynamic versus the HTML, which is static. So it's right sort of in the middle of the HTML towards the end. And the rest of this is all the magic to make the map work. So now once you have this, I'm presenting it here in a web viewer, obviously. And then, it's very dynamic because we're taking advantage of all the things that the internet can do. For example, when I hover over the plot point, it'll show me the company name. When I click on the plot point, it'll show me the company name along with its type and the actual address. And then I even embedded a little key here so we could see the type of company along with what it means. So that's pretty dynamic, pretty cool stuff. Now, you could take this a step further if you wanted to embed, JavaScript inside the HTML, where if you click on the plot point, it could go to a certain record in FileMaker. But that was getting a little bit beyond demonstrating JSON necessarily. But that's how this works. So what I'd like to do is just kind of break this down into pieces so we can see. We get about 10 minutes or so. So let me do that.
Yeah, and actually before you, as
Yeah,
you're
go
getting
ahead.
set up to do that, Jessica did ask a question. So for moving data between tables in FileMaker, is JSON more advantageous to use than import records, for example?
Well, it can be. I mean, when you talk about importing records, that particular script step is not necessarily friendly on the server in the way that it's friendly using FileMaker Pro itself. So a lot of times developers are tempted, for example, let's say they needed to create 100 records and I need to move data from this table to that table. This is a great example of when you might need to either collect data or move it. So a lot of times what we do as developers might develop the solution locally. We might import or export, or we might go FileMaker to FileMaker importing, where I take one table from FileMaker and import it into another. Simple. But that doesn't work on the server. That's not a supported server script step aspect. So if you're going to do it on the server, you have to export it to a CSV to, let's say, the temp directory or the documents folder, and then re-import it. So it's a little clunky compared to maybe moving it as JSON, where you collect it all as JSON and then go and then populate it by parsing the JSON. That's one way to do it. You could use nowadays, and Todd Weller demonstrated this, where the new execute data API can actually write data, where before it could only read data, now it can write data. So that's another option, but that's not necessarily as fast as doing it in other ways. So yeah, I mean, great question. But the import export thing, I think we're moving away from that as FileMaker developers, at least for lightweight data like this, gathering this data. Well, you're going to see here in a minute how we gathered the data.
Yeah,
Any
I think
questions before we move on?
Just feedback on that. Dennis did say, in my experience, if your like tables, field names match exactly, nothing's faster than import. But using JSON gives you some flexibility if you need to move data conditionally, or if your data structures aren't exactly the same. And I'll add, things like FileMaker to FileMaker import, especially if you want to do it server side, work really well if the files are all on the same server, but they don't work if your files are hosted on different servers.
Yeah.
So in that case, you might want to use the execute data API or use JSON to kind of move things between files.
Right. Good. So this first button, create sample data, let me just show you that. So that's over here under this set of demos, create sample data. So this particular script will populate JSON with the insert text, where I mentioned I hard code the actual sample data that we are ultimately going to use. And that's on step 11. So this right here, starting on step 4, where I open the transaction, That's where really the script begins. And then we truncate the table. All I'm doing there is removing any companies that might have been there lingering, just so it's, because it's a demo file, I'm deleting the data and importing it every time, or creating it every time. So that's just a cleanup technique. Then I'm closing any windows that might have been open for the processing part. On step 7, I create a new window, which creates company records. And it goes to the layout companies, because we have to be contextually in the right place. So I go to the companies table. And then, like I said, here's step 11. Let me show you what this looks like. If you look at this one script step, here's my actual sample data. Now, right now, there is a limitation on the number of characters this particular script step can hold. It's 30,000 from what I believe, but there's a strong likelihood that that's going to change in the future. That's all I'll say about that. So that's the JSON. And then, so what I'm doing is I'm populating the variable JSON. And then I'm doing a quick if to make sure that there is JSON to parse. So error trapping is part of your parsing process. We didn't talk about it much, but you can simply, this script step is doing both things. It's both checking to see that the data is there, while at the same time populating a variable called total. And that goes right back to that question early on in the seminar, where how do you count the keys? This is the magic to count the keys. First, you have to list the keys. That's what this function does. And then this function counts the keys that are listed. So that's how you get the total. So this is, depending on your level of FileMaker, this might be, there's a lot happening in this one script step. We're doing almost 3 things at once. We're getting the total, we're validating whether there is something there, and then this is empty is further validating, is there something to parse? And if not, it'll show the dialog, there's nothing here. So it's just standard good practice on how to do that. But just keep in mind that we've collected the total here. That's important. Step 18, very much like we saw, we're just setting the index to 0. I've called the variable index. And then we're looping. And then this loop is creating company after company. And all of these steps are just pulling the JSON based on the things we've already learned with the index. So it's here's pulling the company, here it's pulling the address, the Latin long, and then the marker color from the JSON that was set up here in step 11. And then it exits at the appropriate time based on the total. So if you recall on that first demo, I was hard coding it to 7 or 12. Now I'm not hard coding it at all. I'm actually saying when the total that we collected up here on step 13 equals the index, which is wherever the index is based on the loop, then it's time to exit and we're done. And then final cleanup, close the window, commit the transaction. Now, for those of you, there was some curiosity around the loop defer. This is another one of those curious points, open and close transaction or open and commit transaction. Normally, we think of these script steps as a way to protect our data so that everything happens at once and we know that it's either all going to happen or all not going to happen. But there's an added benefit to this, in that if I were creating records over the wide area network, what happens when you put it inside a transaction like this is it creates the records locally in my local cache, in my FileMaker Pro's local cache. All those records are created. Then once it's satisfied and this commit transaction happens, it takes all those records as a chunk or as a mass and moves them to the server. The net result of that is it's a faster way to create records in FileMaker over the wide area network. So that may not be well known. And of course, it really won't, if you're only dealing with 10 records, it won't matter. But if you now get 100 or more records, you'll actually see a noticeable difference simply by making those records within a transaction. So that's why I wanted to demonstrate that here, just as another best practice as we think about the future. All right, any questions on that before I jump into this next part?
I think you may want to just, I don't see any questions.
Okay.
But you may want to skip the mapping because we are close to running out of
time. Yeah, okay, no problem.
And actually there is a just for confirmation, someone's asking for understanding. So if you defer flush and do things into a transaction, everything is evaluated and built locally first before it's committed to the over the server.
Yeah, that's been my understanding of it. And when I've tested against thousands of records, it's a big improvement in speed. Big. compared to just doing the traditional way without the transaction. The defer in this case still doesn't apply because I don't have any relationships happening here. So again, just a best practice for me to get into the habit of always using defer unless I need to evaluate. Then the only other thing, which I already mentioned, is we're creating the HTML. This script step just populates the HTML from something I grabbed from ChatGPT, make me a map, have it ready to accept JSON data. That's what this does. And then this final thing is really straightforward. It just grabs the data using execute FileMaker data API, which gets it to me in JSON. I parse it and then substitute right here on step 8. We're taking that little placeholder and putting our JSON in instead of the placeholder. And that way we can continue to add to the map easily. It takes that static data, combines it with dynamic data. Great, but this demo will be available to explore for anyone who wants it. It's available. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or.
Yep, Andy just dropped it in chat.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Excellent.
And I will just add, I've opened up our closing poll just to let us know what you thought. And I'll share those results after Mark shows his last bit of demo.
Oh, okay. Well, if we have time for the demo, then I'll show you.
Yeah, if you can do it in 5 minutes.
I can definitely do that in 5 minutes. I just want to show you this particular part of the script because this goes back to Joanne's question and some other questions about the power of this FileMaker data API, the execute FileMaker data API. So what we have here, if I go to the companies table, the companies table and the layout, this is my raw data. So these are the companies that we collected, and this is where we have them. So, but I need this in JSON. How do I get this in JSON easily? Now, I could loop through and do the JSON set element. That's no problem, and that'll work just fine. But there's an elegance to using this other script step, which is the execute FileMaker data API. Some things that you get from this is, number one, it's built in automatically. So the JSON is conjured up very quickly, and it's not something you have to manually construct. The other advantage is you don't have to be on the same layout when it runs. You can be anywhere because you're telling, let me just zoom in on this real quick. And again, Todd covered a lot of this. Sorry. Yeah, JSON. So I'm setting the variable, the address data with this execute SQL. And then this is the command to make that script step operate. And you do have to create a little JSON code to make it operate, but it really only needs one thing. It needs to know the layout. Now you can give it a whole bunch of things. You can give it what you want it to find, how you want it to sort, and a variety of other things. But at its minimum, it just needs to know the layout we're talking about. And if you give it only the layout, which in this case is companies, it will pull all the records in the companies table and present it as JSON. So if I were to run this very quickly through script debugger, let's see what that raw data looks like. So I've just run step 3 here. And if I look at what it created, this is the JSON it just collected from that whole table. I argue that it's even faster than looping through and getting it. It's like immediate. And again, I haven't left the layout, which is another advantage. I mean, the user hasn't left the layout. It does this all behind the scenes. So grab that very quickly. So then you say, okay, well, that's a good way to get the JSON, but what you're getting a little bit more JSON than you need. You're getting all the other FileMaker extras, like the messages and things like that. So this step here is necessary, and I'll just show you, this is pretty advanced coding at the moment, but let me stop the script and just show you the while with a couple of minutes we have left. And yeah, this is fairly advanced. This is something you want to sit down and kind of chew on for a little bit. But the while function is probably the best way to quickly parse JSON. It's really fast because it's not traversing through records. It's not looping through any kind of records and going record by record. It's just taking this JSON chunk of text and it's parsing it here in this loop. And all this is doing is getting the information we need on that only the meat of the data, the middle part of the data, the actual records. And it's pulling just that for us, ignoring the rest of it. So that's this. We need probably 15 minutes to go through this whole while function. And talk about everything that it does, but that's a way of cleaning it up, and that presents it on the list variable. And ultimately, that's what we substitute in our HTML to make the map happen, to make the addresses show up. All right, that's all I have there. So if you want to, here's a QR code that'll get you into a free course that we have. And if you're looking for this particular demo, I've called it Plot Locations on a Map. So if you just jump into this free course, this is just one of many things that we offer in this free course, and you can grab that file and take a look at it and use it however you'd like in your projects or what have you. I also took advantage of all that code that you saw there for the mapping and everything. A lot of that is open source and allows free use at a certain level. So it's not something you even have to pay for to experiment with.
All right, and I'm just responding to a couple of questions. One is, I think this is referring to the execute data API script step.
Right.
Is there a similar way to do that with a found set of data?
Well, the way that that script step works is it's asking you to find based on a query you construct, in much the same way we'd construct a query in a script where you go to enter find mode, set field, set field, set field, perform find. In a way, that execute SQL script step works the same way, but it's going to ask you to put the query in its language in JSON in a certain way. And you can, it's right there in the help. It'll show you how to construct those queries. So that's the only way you're going to get a found set work in that way. No. So the answer is in a pure random found set, one that isn't really constructed in a way that you could find it easily, like a user-based found set where maybe they start with 10 records and they randomly say, I don't want record 3 and record 7. So now you've got this found set that really can't be found any other way other than that one human's personal preference at that point. No, it doesn't do that. You'd actually have to construct some form of formal query. Down the road, or you could potentially grab the IDs from the found set and somehow use that in the query. That would probably work. But there's nothing that says grab the JSON from the found set. Now, if you did need a specialized found set, maybe you wouldn't use that script step. You would do a traditional loop and grab the JSON and construct the JSON using the FileMaker functions set, JSON set element.
All
Just
right,
like
so,
you did, Rosemary, when you did your work.
Yep. Yep. Just a couple more things. Someone did ask and said they'd love a deep dive on the transaction script steps.
Mm-hmm.
And I did drop a link into chat of a session I did with Bob Bowers back in September where we did take a look at that. So please take a look at that and then follow up if you have more questions after that and you think we would be well served by a follow-up session. Deeper dive on transactions. I'm happy to consider that for the future schedule. I'm just trying to scan through. There was a question, I think that came just to me, and I just want to call this out because it's a great point. The execute FileMaker data API script step does not require that you have the data API turned on your FileMaker server. In fact, as Mark just demoed, I think you're working with a local file, right, Mark?
Correct.
Yeah, so it'll work with a local file. It'll work with your server regardless of whether or not it's turned on.
Yes,
And
correct. Yeah.
so thank you, everyone. And if you haven't, before you log off, please do take 2 seconds and fill out our closing poll. And I'll just say that people are primarily pretty confident to use JSON more. And I'm looking at improvements. Transactions seem to be winning. So I think people are going to take a look at this and
great.
Use transactions. Someone else said use while to parse JSON.
Yes.
So I think that's another great trip. So many thanks to everybody who joined us today. And we'll see you in 3 weeks on May 29th. And Rick Coleman will be joining me for that session. And we're going to talk about why it is important to stay current with FileMaker.
It's a good topic.
All right. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
See you soon.